The day Emma Harper arrived in Dustfield, Texas, the town held its breath, because a woman who looked like that, standing alone on a train platform with nothing but a carpetbag and a set of eyes the color of a winter sky, was either the luckiest thing to happen to a dying town or the most dangerous. It was the spring of 1874, and Dustfield had been bleeding out slow since the cattle drive started bypassing it in favor of the newer rail stops further west. The saloon still did business, and the general store still sold flour and dried beans, but the liveliness that had once made the streets ring with laughter and argument had gone quiet, replaced by the sound of wind scraping dirt across wooden storefronts and the occasional bark of a dog with nothing better to do. People still lived there, still raised their children and planted their gardens and argued over property lines, but there was a hollowness to it, like a man who keeps walking after he has already lost his reason for moving. Emma was 24 years old. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned tight at the back of her neck, and a composure that had been earned the hard way. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a seamstress and a man who had promised her mother the world, and then quietly departed for it one morning and never came back. Emma had learned early that promises were only as good as the character behind them, and she had spent the years since becoming someone whose character was worth something. She had taught school in St. Louis for 3 years, and before that she had spent 2 years keeping books for a dry goods company whose owner was too proud to admit he needed the help. She was precise. She was warm in a way that surprised people who first mistook her composure for coldness, and she was, by the spring of 1874, deeply tired of St. Louis. The advertisement had come to her through the county school board. A small frontier town was looking for a schoolteacher willing to relocate. The position came with a small salary, a one-room schoolhouse that reportedly needed significant repair, a furnished room above the dry goods store, and the company of approximately 300 souls who were described, in the stiff language of the posting, as hardworking and neighborly. Emma had read it twice, folded it carefully, and then done something she almost never did. She had made a decision on instinct. She had written back the same day and accepted before she could talk herself out of it. Standing on the platform now, she looked down the length of the main street, past the saloon and the livery stable and a church whose whitewash had gone gray with weather, and she breathed in the smell of dust and horses and something dry and clean that she could not name but immediately liked. Behind her, the train let out a long sigh of steam, as though it had been holding its breath for her, and then the engine groaned and began to move, and just like that, the last connection to the world she had known was gone. She picked up her carpetbag and started walking. The man who ran the dry goods store was named Mr. Beaumont, a round-faced, cheerful person of 50 or so with a white mustache and eyes that suggested he found most things mildly amusing. He showed her upstairs to the furnished room, which turned out to be small but clean, with a window that looked out over the street and a quilt on the bed that was genuinely beautiful, all squares of blue and yellow like pieces of sky in summer. "My late wife made that," Beaumont said, not with grief but with a kind of settled pride. She'd be glad to know it was being used. "It's beautiful," Emma said and meant it. "School's down the south end of town." Well, he paused. "What's left of it? North Wall has a problem, you'll see." Emma saw. The next morning she walked the length of the town to the small schoolhouse that sat at the edge of a field of yellowed grass, and she found a building that was structurally sound except for one corner of the north wall, where the wood had been damaged by water, and then by something that might have been a horse or a fence post colliding with it, and was now bowed inward in a way that was deeply discouraging. The windows were intact. The desks were old but not broken. There was a blackboard that had survived, and a pot-bellied stove that looked like it would still do its job. The room smelled of old wood and chalk dust, and faintly of the particular quality of concentrated young attention that Emma associated with learning. She stood in the middle of it and thought, "This can be fixed." She walked back to the dry goods store and asked Beaumont who in town did carpentry. He thought about it. "Well, he said slowly. "There's Tom Fitch, but he's been down with his back since February and I wouldn't ask him. Old Carson does rough work, but I wouldn't trust him for walls." He rubbed his mustache. "Best man for something like that would be Abraham Alden. He does the ranch work out east of town, but he built half the fencing on the Miller property and put up the new barn at the Coburn place last fall. He's good with his hands and he doesn't cut corners." "Where would I find him?" "Ranch is about 4 miles east. Follow the main road until you see a fork with an old oak on the left, then take the right. Can't miss the property." He paused, and something in his expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile but held the same warmth. "He's a decent man, Miss Harper. Little quiet maybe, but decent." Emma thanked him, borrowed one of the store's horses the following morning, a steady brown mare with patient eyes, and rode the 4 miles east. The ranch was modest but well kept. A main house of squared timber with a good porch, a stable, a fenced pasture where 3 horses stood in the morning sunlight with the particular stillness of animals who have no reason to move and see no reason to manufacture one. A garden to one side that was neatly maintained. A woodpile that was stacked with geometric precision. She tied the mare to the fence post and knocked at the door. The man who answered was not what she had expected, though she had not formed a clear expectation to begin with. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and the kind of face that was not conventionally handsome, but that was deeply and specifically interesting, full of angles and a weathering that spoke of time spent outdoors doing real work. His eyes were a warm amber brown, the color of creek water over flat stone, and they regarded her with a directness that was not rude but was entirely without pretense. He was wearing a work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he held a coffee cup in one hand which he shifted to the other when she spoke. "Mr. Alden," she said. "Yes," he said. "My name is Emma Harper. I'm the new school teacher. Mr. Beaumont said you might be able to help with a repair I need done on the schoolhouse." He looked at her for a moment with that same direct, unhurried attention, and then he opened the door wider and said, "Come in and have some coffee and tell me about it." The inside of the house was clean and functional, with the particular orderliness of a person who lives alone and has made peace with it. There was a table with 2 chairs, a good cookstove, shelves with provisions organized with the same precision as the woodpile outside. On one shelf there were 3 books, which Emma noticed immediately, the way a person notices their own kind. He poured her coffee and sat across from her, and she explained about the north wall. He listened without interrupting, which she found she liked enormously. When she finished, he said, "I can come look at it this week. If it's what you're describing, it'll need the rotted timber pulled and replaced, probably a section about 6 feet long. Maybe 2 days' work, maybe 3 if there's more hidden damage once I open it up." "What would you charge?" she asked. He shook his head slightly. "The school hasn't had a teacher in 2 years, he said. "Town needs it. What are you paying for the repair?" I was going to ask what was fair. "Nothing's fair," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not bitter but philosophical, a man who had thought about fairness and come to terms with its limitations. "But for the school, I won't charge you. It's a thing the town should have done already." Emma looked at him over her coffee cup. "That's very generous, Mr. Alden." "It's practical," he said, and there was just the slightest shift at the corner of his mouth that might, under the right circumstances, become a smile. She rode back to town with the warm feeling of something having begun, though she could not have said precisely what it was, only that the morning felt more full of possibility than it had when she started it. Abraham Alden came to look at the schoolhouse 2 days later, on a Thursday morning when the air was already warm with the promise of a hot afternoon. Emma had been sorting through the existing school materials, a collection of tattered primers and arithmetic books, making notes on what would need to be ordered, and when she heard his boots on the step she felt something that was certainly not nerves, because she was not a nervous person, and yet was something in the same family. He knocked at the open door, which she found mannerly given that it was standing open, and walked in with his hat in his hand and a canvas bag of tools over one shoulder. He looked at the wall, walked over to it, pressed his palm against it in several places, and then crouched down and examined the base where the damage was worst. He was quiet for a long time. Emma watched him work with the same focus she brought to her own work, and found herself paying attention to the way his hands moved over the wood, sure and thorough, testing and learning. "Worse than you thought," he said finally, standing. "How much worse?" "The damage goes further than the visible section. There's a run of soft wood going about 9 feet, maybe 10. I'll need to open it up properly to be sure." He looked at her. "It'll be done before school starts, though. When do you plan to open?" "First Monday of next month," she said. 6 weeks from now." "That's plenty of time," he said. "I'll start Monday." He started Monday, and Emma was there every day, partly because she had work to do in the schoolhouse and partly because, she eventually admitted to herself, she found his company pleasant in a way that was quieter and more substantial than anything she had found pleasant in a long time. He worked steadily without rushing, replacing the damaged timber section by section, his movements efficient and unhurried. He did not talk constantly, which she appreciated, but when he did speak it was worth listening to. On the second day, he stopped in the middle of fastening a board to look at the books she had stacked on a desk and ask which one she thought was most important for children to read first, not which one was in the curriculum, but which one she thought mattered most. It was the kind of question that assumed she had thought about it and had a real answer, and she found herself giving one that she had never articulated out loud before, something about stories being the first way children learn that other minds exist, that other lives are real and worth imagining, and that arithmetic could wait a week before stories. He listened to all of it and then said, "My mother believed the same thing," and went back to work. On the third day it rained, a sudden hard rain that came in from the west with no warning, and Emma ran to close the schoolhouse windows, while Abraham pulled a tarp over the section of wall he had opened to the elements. They stood inside listening to the rain hit the roof, which held perfectly well, and drank coffee from a shared tin that she had brought from her room, and he told her something about the town's history, about how Dustfield had been a real going concern in the late 1860s when the cattle trails ran through it, and how the shift in the trails had been slow but inevitable, like a river changing course. He spoke about it without self-pity as a fact of the world, but there was something underneath the steadiness that she heard clearly, a man who had chosen to stay somewhere others had left, and who had his reasons. "Why did you stay?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "My father built the ranch," he said. "He died before he got to see it finished. Seemed like leaving would be letting that go for nothing." It was not a sentimental answer. It was the answer of a person who understood that some things matter not because they are grand but because they are real. "How old are you, Mr. Alden?" she asked. 28, he said. "You?" 24, she said. He nodded as though this information had been filed away somewhere useful. They finished the coffee, and he went back to work in the rain, wearing his hat and moving with the calm of a person who has made peace with weather. Emma watched him from the doorway for a moment before going back to her primers, and thought that Beaumont had been right. He was a decent man. There were not, it turned out, so many of those. The school opened on the first Monday of June with 14 children enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 13, and it was immediately clear that Emma was exactly the right person for the job. She had a natural authority that did not need raising her voice to enforce, and a warmth that made the children feel that learning was a thing being offered to them rather than required of them. The room was clean, the wall was solid and freshly repaired, and Emma stood in front of it with the particular satisfaction of a person who has found the place where their capabilities and the world's needs align. Abraham had finished the repair the previous Friday, and she had thanked him properly, with a dinner she cooked on the dry goods store's small kitchen stove, a simple meal of roast chicken and cornbread that she had learned from her mother, and they had eaten it at Beaumont's table since Beaumont himself was spending that evening with his sister-in-law across town. It had felt easy and natural, and also, she had thought afterward, going back over it in the evening light from her window, entirely like the beginning of something. He came to town on Saturdays, which she discovered were his supply days, and they fell into a habit of walking together down the main street, calling in on the general store and sometimes the post office, and stopping eventually at the small cafe that Mrs. Chen ran out of the front room of her house at the end of the street. Mrs. Chen had come west with her husband in 1868, and her husband had died of fever in 1870, and she had stayed because she had nowhere better to go and because she was, as she explained to Emma on the occasion of their first meeting, a person who did not accept defeat as a permanent condition. Emma liked her immediately and enormously. At Mrs. Chen's, they drank tea that tasted different from anything Emma had had before, and ate the small pastries that Mrs. Chen made with whatever she had and talked. They talked about everything. They talked about the books on Abraham's shelf, which turned out to be a biography of Lincoln, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman that Abraham owned without apology, and a battered copy of Moby Dick that he had read twice and was uncertain about. They talked about the town and its people, and the slow business of what it meant to build something worth building. They talked about Emma's childhood in St. Louis, about her mother's particular brand of courage, about Abraham's father and the ranch and the years he had spent working it alone since his father's death. He had a sister, he told her one Saturday afternoon at the end of June. Her name was Ruth. She had married a man from Abilene in 1871 and moved there, and they wrote letters regularly, and he missed her with a steady, undemonstrative constancy that was, Emma thought, entirely characteristic of him. "She'd like you," he said, somewhat abruptly, one afternoon when they were walking back from Mrs. Chen's. Emma glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead in the way he sometimes did when he said something that mattered and then acted as though he had simply remarked on the weather. "I'd like to meet her someday," Emma said carefully. He nodded, still looking forward. "Someday," he said, in a tone that suggested he was making a note of it. The summer settled over Dustfield like a warm hand, and the town found its rhythm. Emma taught school 5 days a week, and spent her evenings grading work or reading or writing letters to her mother back in St. Louis, in which she described the town and the children and the flat, wide sky, and the smell of the evenings when the heat began to soften and something that was not exactly peace, but was very close to it moved through the streets. She did not, in the early letters, write about Abraham. She was not sure what she would say. He was not a man who announced things. He was not a man who made speeches or performed, but he noticed things. He noticed that she mentioned, once in passing, that she found the schoolhouse cold in the mornings before the stove had warmed it, and the following week he arrived before school started and cut and stacked enough firewood at the schoolhouse door to last several weeks, without mentioning it. He noticed that she had been struggling with a particular student, a 9-year-old boy named Caleb whose father was drinking heavily since the boy's mother had died, and who sat in school with the closed, sealed quality of a person who has learned that the world does not reliably reward attention. And one afternoon Abraham stopped by the schoolhouse after hours and asked if he could bring Caleb to the ranch on the following Saturday to see the horses. He had, he said, found when he was young that horses were sometimes easier to approach than people when you were not feeling right about the world. Emma agreed immediately. Caleb came home from that Saturday with his face slightly open for the first time in weeks, carrying the distinct but fragile air of a child who has remembered that something good is possible. These were not small things. Emma knew how to recognize the weight of attention that cost someone something, and she understood that what Abraham Alden gave was always the real thing, never the performance of it. She fell in love with him the way a river finds its channel, not all at once but in stages, finding the path that the landscape had already, without announcement, prepared for it. She was not the only one who noticed the growing familiarity between them. Mrs. Chen watched them from across her teacups with the precise, amused look of a woman who has seen many things and knows what she is seeing. Beaumont said nothing, but had taken to leaving a lamp on in the store hallway on the evenings when Emma came home late from one errand or another, which was, in its small way, a benediction. The town noted, in the way that small towns always note these things, that the schoolteacher and Abraham Alden kept company on Saturdays, and the general opinion, from what Emma could gather, was warm. Abraham was aware of it too, she could see. Not uncomfortable with it, but thoughtful, in the way that a careful man is thoughtful about things that matter. He was not a person who moved quickly. He had spent most of his 20s building a ranch and keeping it solvent in a town that was slowly losing its economic reason to exist, and there was a patience in him that ran deep, the patience of a person who understands that real things take real time. But there was also something in him that was moving, that had been moving since the first morning she had knocked on his door and asked about the wall, and she could feel it the way you feel the change in a river's current before you can see the faster water ahead. It came to a point on a Thursday evening in late July. There had been a social at the church, a modest affair with pie and lemonade, and a fiddle player named Old Pete who played 3 songs with genuine skill, and then 2 more from memory that were somewhat less faithful to their originals. Emma had gone because several of her students' families would be there and she wanted to know them better, and Abraham had come because, when she had mentioned it on the previous Saturday, he had said he might stop by. He had stopped by. They had stood together along the far wall, talking with the Harmon family, and then with the Coburns whose barn he had built. And Old Pete had moved into a waltz that was slow and somewhat experimental, and the small cleared floor had 2 or 3 couples moving on it, and Abraham had turned to her and said, with the particular quiet intensity that she had come to understand was his version of earnestness, "Would you dance with me, Miss Harper?" She had said yes. He danced the way he did everything else, with a careful, genuine attention that was not about showing off, but about doing the thing properly. His hand at her back was steady, and his eyes, when he looked at her, had that direct quality that she had found disconcerting at first and now found entirely necessary. They were closer than they had been before, the way that dancing makes you closer than the rest of the world does, and in the middle of the 3rd bar of the waltz he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "I think about you a great deal, Emma." She had not been called Emma by him before. It was always Miss Harper, with a formality that she had come to think of as a kind of respect rather than distance. The sound of her name in his voice did something to her that she was not prepared for, which was unusual because she had, over the course of her adult life, made a careful habit of being prepared. "I think about you too," she said. She could feel her own heartbeat with an unusual clarity. "I'm not good at this," he said. There was not apology in it but honesty, which was better. "I think you're doing well," she said, and meant it on several levels at once. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, with the same care he brought to everything, he said, "When I finish the fencing on the east pasture next month, I'd like to take you out to see the land east of the property. There's a stretch where the hill turns and you can see for 30 miles. I've been meaning to show someone and haven't had the right person to show it to." It was not a declaration. It was Abraham Alden telling her, in the language natural to him, that she was the right person. She understood it perfectly. "I'd like that," she said. Old Pete's waltz ended in a somewhat unplanned manner, and the couples parted, and the evening continued. But the thing between them had shifted perceptibly into a new register, one that was warmer and cleaner and more honest. August came in hard and hot, the way August in Texas always does, and Dustfield sat under a bleached sky and conducted its business in the shade when possible. School was in summer recess, and Emma used the time to write to the county for more books and to spend time with the families in town, building the relationships that she understood were essential to the work she was doing. She called on Mrs. Chen regularly and spent 2 mornings a week helping Beaumont with his accounts, which were maintained in a cheerful disorder that she gently organized over the course of several weeks. On the last Saturday of August, Abraham came to take her to see the land east of the ranch. He arrived at the dry goods store at 7 in the morning with 2 horses, the steady brown mare she had used before and his own, a dark gray with a rangy, capable look. He had packed provisions for the day, the way a practical person packs for a thing they are going to do properly, and he helped her into the saddle with a hand that was brief and matter-of-fact, and yet, she thought, not entirely without intention. They rode east in the cool of the early morning, past the ranch and into open country that grew more dramatic as the land began to rise. The grass was dry and gold in the late summer, and the sky above it was a shade of blue that she had only seen out here, a blue that seemed to have more dimensions than the city sky she had grown up under. They rode mostly in companionable silence, pointing things out to each other now and then, a hawk turning on the thermals, a line of cottonwoods following an invisible waterway below the ridge. The hill he had mentioned turned out to be a long slope that climbed gradually for about a mile before arriving at a crest from which the land opened up below and around in every direction, 30 miles at least, the grassland rolling out to the south and west and north in waves of gold and green, the sky meeting it at a horizon that looked farther away than horizons usually do, as though the world had decided to show you as much of itself as it possibly could. Emma stood at the crest with the wind moving her hair loose from its pins and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Yes," she said finally. It was the only word that seemed adequate. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool morning air. "My father found this spot," he said. "He used to say that if you could see this much of the world and still feel small, you were paying proper attention." Emma turned to look at him. He was looking at the view, but his expression had the quality of a person who is also looking at something internal, something he had carried a long time. "He sounds like a wise man," she said. "He was," Abraham said. He paused. "He would have liked you." She thought about the way he had said the same thing about his sister, and understood that he was building something with these statements, placing her, carefully and deliberately, into the picture of his life. "Abraham," she said, and his name in her mouth felt right in a way that she had been waiting to find out. He looked at her then, fully, with all that direct amber-brown attention. "I have been trying to think of the best way to say what I want to say," he said, "and I've concluded that I don't have one. But I have the thing I want to say, so I'll say it plainly. I love you, Emma Harper. I think I have since approximately the second day I was working on your schoolhouse wall, though I don't expect that to be any kind of declaration you need to act on immediately. I'm just telling you because it's the truth, and I don't see a reason to keep it in." Emma Harper, who was not a crying person, and was in fact rather proud of being the kind of person who kept herself composed, felt her eyes fill in a way that surprised her. Not from sadness and not quite from joy, but from the specific emotion of being seen completely and told so, which was rarer than any other gift she had been given. "I love you too," she said. It came out steady and clear, and she was glad of that. "I think since the rain," he thought about it. "The third day," he said. "Yes." A slow smile crossed his face, the first full smile she had seen from him, and it transformed everything. It was warm and slightly wondering and entirely unguarded, and she thought she could spend a considerable amount of time looking at it. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood there at the top of the hill with 30 miles of the world spread before them and the wind moving through the gold grass, and it was the most complete she had felt in a very long time. They rode back to town in the afternoon with the sun slanting long and the horses moving easy, and something had settled between them that was not new in its feeling but new in its acknowledgement, like a country that has always existed and has now finally been named on the map. The weeks that followed had a quality that Emma found herself reaching for words to describe and coming up with things like golden, which was not a word she had used about her life before. She was still practical, still purposeful, still exactly herself. But underneath the daily work and responsibility, there was a warmth that was constant and reliable, something she returned to in quiet moments the way you return to a fire. Abraham came to town twice a week now instead of once. He ate dinner with her at Beaumont's table 3 evenings in 4. They read to each other in the evenings, which had been her idea, and which he had taken to with an enthusiasm that she suspected had been there all along, waiting for permission. He had a good speaking voice, low and even, and when he read Whitman out loud in her small room above the store, with the lamp turned up in the night outside the window full of stars, she thought there was nowhere else in the world she would rather be. She wrote her mother a proper letter about him in September, a full account, sparing no important detail. Her mother wrote back in 2 weeks in her precise seamstress hand, and the letter said, among other things, that she sounded happy in a way I have not heard in your letters since before you were old enough to understand that the world was harder than it looked, and that she wanted a photograph of him as soon as that was reasonably possible. Emma showed Abraham the relevant section. He read it and then said with perfect seriousness, "Tell her I'll arrange the photograph." There was a traveling photographer who came through the county towns every couple of months, and Emma wrote to her mother that the photograph would be forthcoming. October came with a sharpness to the air that made the mornings bright and definite, and the cottonwoods along the creek south of town went gold and then copper, and the light changed to that particular long amber of the autumn plains. School was back in session, and Emma had 16 students now, 2 more families having been persuaded to enroll their children after a summer of hearing good reports. Caleb, the boy she had worried about, had not been fixed, because children could not be fixed, but he had been reminded that the world had things in it worth his attention, and he came to school with a watchful openness that was, she thought, the beginning of something real. It was on an afternoon in the 2nd week of October that the question of permanence presented itself. They were sitting on his porch in the early evening, having ridden out after school let out, watching the sun go down over the pasture in the particular way it went down on the plains, slowly and completely, taking its time about it as though it understood that this was worth watching. He had made coffee, and they sat with their cups in the view, and she was aware that he had been thinking about something all afternoon with a quiet intensity she had learned to recognize. "I want to ask you something," he said. He looked at his coffee cup, and then at her with an expression that was not nervous but was careful in the way of a person who understands that certain words, once said, change the geography of things permanently. "Then ask it," she said gently. "Emma Harper," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not dressed up. It was not accompanied by anything except the sunset and the coffee and the absolute sincerity of a man who meant every syllable. She had thought about this. She was an honest person, and she knew herself well enough to admit that she had thought about it. She had thought about what it would mean, this life in this town, teaching school and building something here with this particular man who was quiet and good and entirely himself. She had thought about her mother in St. Louis and about the distance. She had thought about the life she had left and the life that was here, and she had concluded with the thoroughness she brought to every real decision that this was true and the other thing had been waiting. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He set down his coffee cup and took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the size of them, and kissed her in the amber evening light, and the horses in the pasture stood very still, and the sun finished going down, and the sky above the plains was deep and clear and full of the particular promise of the western night. They married in December, in the church whose whitewash had by then been repainted by a volunteer effort that Beaumont had organized, partly in honor of the occasion. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through Dustfield on his regular rounds, a thin, humorous man named Reverend Gates who had been doing marriages and baptisms and funerals across 4 counties for 15 years, and had, in that time, developed a reliable sense for which couples meant what they were saying. He told Emma afterward, shaking her hand with both of his, that he expected her and Mr. Alden to be one of those couples he heard about for years afterward in the way of good news, which had, he said, a distinctive quality he had learned to recognize and trusted completely. Emma's mother had come out from St. Louis for the wedding, arriving on the train 3 days before with 2 trunks and a composure that was clearly the source of Emma's own, and a look for Abraham when they first met that was measuring and direct, and entirely like her daughter. Abraham bore it with his characteristic calm and apparently passed whatever the examination was, because by the second evening Emma's mother was helping him mend a piece of harness at the kitchen table and telling him stories about Emma's childhood that Emma would have preferred to remain in St. Louis. The wedding was small, as weddings in Dustfield tended to be, but it was full. The church held most of the town, which was not as large as it once had been but was not gone either, and Mrs. Chen sat in the front row and wept openly and without apology, which was exactly what the occasion deserved. Beaumont walked Emma down the aisle, since there was no father to do it, and did so with the quiet dignity of a man who understands when he has been given an honor. Emma wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored wool with small pearl buttons, altered from a pattern she had sent to St. Louis for in October, and she wore her hair down for the first time since arriving in Dustfield, which turned out to be a significant moment in the town's communal consciousness, judging by the collective intake of breath when she walked in. Abraham stood at the front of the church in a clean dark coat and looked at her with an expression that was purely and completely unguarded, in a way that she had seen from him exactly once before, on the hill east of the ranch, and she walked toward it as steadily as she had walked down the train platform the day she arrived, with the same assurance and the same sense of something beginning. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, but they said them in the manner of people who have thought carefully about each word and found it to be true. The winter settled around the ranch with the quiet efficiency of seasons that know their work, and Emma moved her things from the room above the dry goods store to the ranch house with a practical simplicity that did not make a production of itself. The ranch house had seemed spare when she first saw it, but it became the kind of home that fills itself from the inside out, with the smell of food cooking and books on more shelves, and the particular sound of 2 people who have chosen each other moving through the rooms of their shared life. She continued teaching school, which no one had questioned, and she would not have permitted anyone to question, riding the 4 miles to town on the brown mare in the mornings and back in the afternoons in weather that ranged from cold and clear to cold, and less clear as the plains winter did its worst, and then gradually relented. Abraham had built up the fire each morning before she left and had coffee ready when she returned in the afternoons, and if this was not the definition of a good partnership then, Emma did not know what was. In January, a situation arose that tested the easy happiness of the new year with the kind of trouble that the frontier delivered without warning. It came in the form of a man named Calvert, who appeared in Dustfield in the second week of January with 2 other men, and a letter from a land surveying company claiming to represent a railroad interest that had, according to the letter, a prior claim on a section of land that included the eastern pasture of the Alden ranch. The letter was the kind of letter that large outside interests had been sending to small landholders across the West since the railroad expansion began in earnest, and Emma, who had kept books for a dry goods company and knew how documents worked, read it with a cold and very clear anger. The claim was not valid. She was certain of it. It referenced survey numbers that were inconsistent with the county land registry that Beaumont kept a copy of behind his counter, and it claimed a recording date that she strongly doubted would survive examination. Abraham read it with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and then set it down and was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," he said, "that someone is hoping I don't know enough to argue." "You know enough," she said, and I know more." He looked at her with the warm steadiness that she had come to think of as his love made visible in the everyday. "I know you do," he said. "Emma wrote a letter that afternoon to the county land office in the county seat, requesting a formal statement of the Alden property's registered boundaries and the recording history of the title. She wrote a second letter to a lawyer in Abilene, whose name she had gotten from Abraham's sister Ruth in correspondence, explaining the situation with the precision of a person who had spent years working with documents and knew exactly what information was relevant. The response from the county land office came within the week, and it was unambiguous. The Alden property's title had been properly recorded in 1869 by Abraham's father, Thomas Alden, with full legal standing, and the boundaries described in Calvert's letter did not correspond to any registered claim held by the railroad interest named. The response from the Abilene lawyer came 2 weeks after that, with the additional information that the surveying company named in Calvert's letter had, in the previous year, been involved in 2 other similar claim disputes in adjacent counties, both of which had been dismissed when the landholders had known enough to challenge them. Emma presented all of this to Calvert at a meeting that took place in Beaumont's store, with Beaumont and the town sheriff, a solid man named Garrett who had served the county for 12 years, present as witnesses. She did it with the same direct composure she brought to teaching a room full of children, and she did not raise her voice. And when she was finished, Calvert looked at the documents and then at her, and then at Abraham, and then, with the specific deflation of a man who had expected to push against nothing and found instead something solid, he left. The sheriff said afterward that he had seen more than a few of these claim attempts in recent years, and that he was glad the Aldens had known how to respond. Abraham thanked him. Emma thanked him. And then they rode home in the January cold with the satisfaction of people who have protected something worth protecting. That evening, sitting by the fire, Abraham said quietly, "My father would have lost that ranch." Emma looked up from the letter she was writing to her mother. "He would have worked himself into the ground and never thought to look at the papers," Abraham said. "He trusted people too much. It was a good quality and it was also a vulnerability." "You trusted me," Emma said. He looked at her with that complete, unhurried attention. "I trusted you completely," he said. "That's different." She set down her letter and went and sat beside him and leaned against his shoulder, and the fire made its quiet sound, and outside the Texas night was cold and clear and full of stars. Spring came back around the way it always did, with a reliability that the plains did not always manage in other respects, but that it delivered in the seasons. And with the spring came letters from Ruth in Abilene saying that she and her husband James were planning to visit in May, and the news that Emma had been keeping to herself since March, waiting to be certain, which she had now confirmed to her own satisfaction. She told Abraham on an evening when the light was exactly like the evening he had proposed, the sun going long and amber over the pasture, and she had not planned the timing but found it appropriate. She said simply that she thought they were going to have a child. He was very still for a moment, the way he was still when something mattered enormously, and then his expression did the thing it had done at the wedding and on the hill, opening completely and without reservation, and he pulled her against him with both arms and held her there for a long time without speaking. And when he did speak, his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before, a quality that was wonder without a ceiling on it. "When?" he asked. "November, I think," she said. "Give or take." "I'll build on," he said. He meant the house. She had not thought about it yet, but she immediately understood what he meant. "I've been thinking about adding a room on the south side anyway. It gets the morning light." This was Abraham, she thought. The immediate practical love of it, the way his mind went from wonder to building, because building was how he loved. "Good," she said. "Something with a good window." Ruth and James arrived in May as promised, and the visit was everything that a visit between people who have heard about each other for a long time and are now finally meeting should be. Ruth was Abraham's sister in the exact specific way that his way of paying attention was the male version of hers, And the two women liked each other immediately and talked for 3 days with the enthusiasm of people who have found an unexpected resonance. James was a quiet, good-natured man from Ohio who had made his life in Abilene as a grain merchant and who clearly adored Ruth in a way that was evident in every interaction, and that Emma found enormously encouraging as evidence that the Alden family ran to good choices. Over dinner on the second evening, Ruth leaned across the table toward Emma with the expression of a woman who has been watching something for 2 days and has arrived at her conclusion. "You've made him happy," she said. "Actually happy." "I wasn't sure I'd see that." Emma glanced across the table at Abraham, who was explaining something about pasture drainage to James with the intense care he brought to any practical subject. "He's made me happy too," Emma said, because it was true and because it was the right answer. "He used to have a way of being very quiet that wasn't peaceful," Ruth said. "It was more like he just locked the door from the inside. These days it looks different." Emma thought about that. "Less like a locked door," she said. "Exactly," Ruth said. "More like a house with the lights on." They stayed for a week and left with promises of return and a standing invitation that was meant on both sides. And the visit left behind it the particular warmth of family made real, which was something Abraham had had abstractly since Ruth moved away, and now had in a more daily and concrete way through Emma herself. The summer of 1875 was gentler than the summer before, or perhaps it only seemed that way because the circumstances were different. The school continued to grow, the enrollment climbing to 22 students by July, when several families who had been deliberating for months finally decided the school was a permanent fixture worth committing to. Emma organized the older children into a reading group that met on Friday afternoons, and the reading group became its own small thing of value in the community, filtering stories and ideas into homes that had been somewhat starved for them. Abraham added the room onto the south side of the house, working in the evenings and on weekends through June and July, and the room was finished in August with a window that caught the morning light exactly as promised. He built a small cradle in September, from the same wood as the house, with a care and precision that made Emma watch him from the doorway for long moments, moved by the sight of a man building something for a person who was not yet born, but who was already completely real to both of them. She continued teaching through September and the first week of October, when the county sent a substitute teacher for the remainder of the term, an arrangement she had made in advance. She spent the last weeks of October in the ranch house, doing the things that needed doing and reading and writing and being, for the first time in her adult life, entirely unscheduled in a way she found both foreign and restful. Abraham had a way of checking on her that was never hovering or anxious, but was a consistent, quiet presence, appearing in whatever room she was in at regular intervals with the kind of non-event visits that said, without words, that he was aware of her and glad of her being there. On the 4th day of November, in the year 1875, their son was born. It was a long labor and a hard one, attended by the town's doctor, a capable man named Henley who had trained in the East before coming west for reasons he did not fully explain, and by Mrs. Chen, who had appointed herself to attend and whose presence Emma had insisted on. Abraham waited in the main room of the house through the hours of it, and Emma could hear him, between the harder parts, moving with the steady, contained energy of a man keeping himself from catastrophizing through the application of continual small, useful tasks. When it was done and the baby was placed in her arms and she heard his first full-throated announcement of himself into the world, she felt a wholeness that was different from any wholeness she had previously known, larger and more complicated and more complete. She heard Abraham's voice in the doorway. She looked up. The expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen from him, all the careful composure entirely gone, replaced by something that was so full and open that she felt it like warmth crossing the room. "Come see your son," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this small new person, and the look on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life, A man encountering love of a scale he had not previously calibrated for, and finding it not frightening but absolutely right. "What do we call him?" Abraham asked, very quietly, as though loud words might be inappropriate for the occasion. They had discussed names for weeks without settling. Now, looking at her son, Emma found that one came forward with complete clarity. "Thomas," she said, "after your father." Abraham was quiet for a moment. She could see the line of his jaw move. He reached out one large, careful hand and very gently touched the baby's cheek, and the baby turned toward it with the instinctive response of newborns that is not quite recognition, but is something close to it. "Thomas," he said. "Yes." Thomas Alden came into the world with strong opinions about his comfort and no hesitation about expressing them, and the first months of his life were both the most exhausting and the most filled with wondering that Emma had experienced. She found that the love she had for him did not subtract from any other love but added to it, expanding the available warmth in a way she had not known was possible. Her mother came from St. Louis in January, making the trip west for the second time with a trunk full of practical gifts, and the composed, deep gladness of a woman seeing her daughter settled and complete. She stayed for 3 weeks and spent most of it at the kitchen table with Thomas in her arms, telling him, in a low, even voice, stories about the world as she had seen it, which Emma thought was an excellent beginning. Abraham watched his mother-in-law with Thomas and said, one evening after she had gone to bed, "She's remarkable." "She made herself that way," Emma said. "She didn't start with advantages." "Neither did you," he said. "I had her," Emma said. "That was an advantage." He thought about that in his thorough way. "Fair," he said. The town of Dustfield itself was changing in small ways that Emma watched with interest. The school had become, in its modest way, a stabilizing force, something that anchored families to the place and gave them a reason to stay and invest in the community. 2 new families had moved into town in the fall of 1875, drawn partly by the school's reputation and partly by the general sense that the place was not dying after all, that it had found some new equilibrium. A second merchant had opened on the main street, a hardware store that served the ranches in the surrounding area. The saloon remained the saloon, but it had painted its front and put in new windows, which Emma took as a sign of something. Mrs. Chen was, by the summer of 1876, teaching a small cooking class out of her front room twice a week, which drew women from across the county, and which generated, as a side effect, exactly the kind of community fabric that towns required to stay alive. She and Emma had become the kind of friends who did not need to explain themselves to each other, who could sit together in productive silence or in full-throated argument with equal ease. Emma thought of her as family, and Mrs. Chen, who had lost her own family to distance and circumstance and the hard arithmetic of the frontier, received this with the particular grace of a person who has learned not to decline real things. Abraham expanded the ranch in the spring of 1876, adding acreage to the east that gave the pasture more room and the operation more viability. He had been methodical about the finances, the way he was methodical about everything, and the ranch was in better shape than it had been when his father died, not dramatically so, not wealthy by any standard, but stable and growing in the slow, compounding way of things that are being done properly. Thomas, at 7 months, had discovered that the world had texture, and was deeply invested in experiencing as much of it as possible from whatever surface he could reach, which made him an engaged and demanding companion for the hours when Emma was not teaching. She had arranged, with the instinctive practicality that characterized her, for the Harmon family's eldest daughter, a responsible 15-year-old named Clara, to come to the ranch during school hours, and the arrangement worked well for everyone. Caleb, the boy she had worried about in her first year, had by the end of his second year with her become one of her most engaged students, with a particular facility for arithmetic that surprised everyone except Emma, who had suspected it for some time. His father had stopped drinking, or mostly stopped, with the help of the reverend who came through and a willingness that the man himself had found somewhere in the intervening year. It was not a complete transformation, because the world did not deliver complete transformations, but it was real improvement, and real improvement was not nothing. On a warm evening in the June of 1876, Emma and Abraham sat on the porch of the ranch house in the long evening light, with Thomas asleep inside in his cradle and the horses in the pasture and the sky going through its elaborate sunset performance, and Abraham said, in the tone he used for things he had been thinking about for a while, "I'm glad you came." She looked at him. "So am I," she said. "I mean specifically," he said. "I mean I'm glad it was you specifically who came and not someone else. I know that sounds like a small thing to say." "It doesn't sound small at all," she said. He looked at the sunset. "I used to think about this land and this ranch as the thing I was committed to," he said, "like it was the center of everything, and now it's part of the center, but it's not all of it. You and Thomas are more of it. I just want you to know that I know the difference." Emma sat with that for a moment. The sunset was doing its final, elaborate work, the sky moving through amber to rose to a deep, saturated blue-violet at the horizon. "I came here to teach," she said. "I thought that was the whole of it. The job and the new place and the work. And it is part of it, and it matters a great deal. But you're the part I didn't expect, and you're the part that made this a life instead of just a location." He reached over and took her hand, the same straightforward, deliberate way he had taken it the first time at the top of the hill with 30 miles of the world spread out below them. "I want to go up to the hill again," she said. "When Thomas is a bit older," he said. "I want to take him." "Yes," she said. "Let's take him." In the fall of 1876, a letter came from Ruth in Abilene with news that she and James were expecting their first child in the spring. And the letter had the quality of a person writing happiness down quickly before it could get away. Emma wrote back at length, drawing on her own experience with the good parts emphasized, and the harder parts represented honestly but not disproportionately, because she believed in telling people the truth in a way that respected their ability to handle it. The winter of 1876 was colder than the previous one, and the ranch required more work to manage through it. But it was the kind of hard work that Abraham had always done, and that Emma had grown into without particularly noticing it. The daily physical labor of keeping animals fed and warm, and a household running in conditions that the frontier delivered with impersonal thoroughness. She had changed in the years since arriving in Dustfield, not in her essential self, which remained clear and purposeful and warm, but in the capabilities that surrounded that self, the things she knew how to do, and the conditions she knew how to manage. Thomas, at 13 months, was walking with the headlong enthusiasm of a child who has recently discovered ambulation and intends to use it everywhere, and the ranch house had been reorganized around the fact of a mobile small person with no concept of danger. He had Abraham's eyes and Emma's stubbornness, and the combination was, all observers agreed, likely to result in a person of significant character. In March of 1877, Ruth had a boy, who they named Henry, and the letter describing his arrival was one of the happiest documents Emma had read, full of the specific, incoherent joy of new parenthood that she recognized completely. Spring came to the plains in its gradual way, the grass greening up from the south, and the cottonwoods budding along the creek, and the sky losing its winter austerity and becoming the deep, complex blue that it was the rest of the year. Emma returned to school after the winter recess with the particular energy she always found returning, the pleasure of reunion with her students, and the fresh beginning of a new term. Dustfield was, by the spring of 1877, a noticeably different town than the one Emma had stepped off the train into 3 years before. The school was a given, an established fact of the community. The population had stabilized and was slowly growing. The hardware store had added a second employee. Mrs. Chen had painted the front of her house. The church had a new bell, donated by a family named Whitfield who had come from Tennessee the previous summer, and had decided, with a speed that suggested they recognized a good thing to stay. There were still the hardships that were inseparable from the frontier, and Emma was not naive about them. The land could be brutal, and the weather could be brutal, and the economics of small-town life on the plains required a constant adaptation. There were still the broader injustices of the era that she was aware of and troubled by, the ongoing displacement of native peoples from their lands, the persistent inequalities that followed women and those who were not white through every transaction with the official world. These were not things that were solved by falling in love and building a school and a ranch, and she did not pretend that they were. But she taught her students to read and to think, and she modeled in her own life the kind of consideration of other people's full humanity that she believed was the beginning of anything better, and she thought that was real work, if not sufficient work. On a Saturday in the early summer of 1877, Emma and Abraham rode to the top of the hill east of the ranch with Thomas in a carrier on Abraham's back, the way they had discussed, and they stood at the crest with the world spread out below them in 30 miles of gold and green, and Thomas looked at it all with the total, open-mouthed attention of a child seeing something enormously large for the first time. "What do you think?" Abraham asked his son. Thomas said something that was not a word but had the emphatic quality of an opinion, and pointed outward with a small, decisive hand. Emma laughed, and the laugh carried out into the open air and disappeared into all that space in the way that sounds do out on the plains, not echoing but simply becoming part of the distance. Abraham reached over with his free hand and found hers, and they stood there, the three of them, at the place his father had shown him and he had shown her, and they were now showing their son, and the line of it ran back through the years and forward into whatever came next, and it felt like exactly what it was. By the late summer of 1877, Emma had something else to tell Abraham, the particular something that had announced itself the previous November with Thomas, and was now announcing itself again with the same quiet certainty. She told him on the porch in the evening, as had apparently become their tradition, and his reaction was the same wide-open wonder as the first time, with an additional quality of warmth that came from knowing the territory, from having been here before and knowing that what lay ahead was real and good and worth the work of it. "Do you want a daughter?" he asked. "I want whoever comes," she said. "You." "The same," he said, and meant it. The months of the second pregnancy moved through their seasons with the full life of the ranch and the school and the town moving alongside them, and Thomas grew from a toddler with opinions into a small boy with more opinions, and a particular attachment to the horses that had been, Abraham said with quiet pleasure, entirely predictable. Clara Harmon continued to help with Thomas on school days, and the arrangement had become something more like family than employment. It was on a cold February morning in 1878 that their daughter arrived, smaller and more immediately certain of her agenda than Thomas had been, and she came into the world with a focus that suggested she had plans. Emma held her and looked at Abraham, who was sitting beside her with the same open expression as before, and said, "Margaret, for your mother." Abraham's mother had died when he was 15, and he had not spoken of her often, but Emma had paid attention over the years and understood that this was a name that mattered. He looked at their daughter for a long moment, this new small person with the already unmistakable quality of her own distinct self. "Margaret Alden," he said softly. "Yes," Emma said. "Dr. Henley declared both mother and child in excellent health. Mrs. Chen, once again present and essential, made tea that she served to everyone including the doctor, and announced that Margaret was going to be a person of great determination, which no one present doubted. The spring of 1878 brought the traveling photographer through Dustfield, finally, on his circuit, and Emma remembered her mother's request from years ago and arranged for a proper photograph. They stood in front of the ranch house, Abraham and Emma with Thomas on his feet beside them and Margaret in Emma's arms, and the photographer, a cheerful man from Philadelphia who found the western light excellent for his work, arranged them, and then stepped behind his equipment and made them still and captured them there, in that moment of their life, solid and real and together. Emma sent the photograph to her mother with a letter that described everything in it and more, and her mother's response came back in a letter that was shorter than usual and said simply, "I can see you are happy, truly happy. That is the thing I always wanted to give you and could not, and you found it yourself, which is better. You are your own person and this is yours. I love you." Emma read it twice and then folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box on the bedroom shelf where she kept things that mattered. The summer of 1878 was good and warm and full, and the life on the ranch had a rhythm by now that was deep and established. The kind of rhythm that is not routine in the deadening sense, but is the cadence of a life that knows what it is. Abraham worked the ranch with the steadiness that was his nature, and that had, over the years, been supplemented by a hired hand named Elias, a young man of 20 from a family in the county seat who had needed work, and proved to be capable and honest. Emma taught school 5 days a week, and came home in the afternoons to the house that was now full of children and books and the productive noise of people living. Thomas, who was nearly 3, had taken a strong interest in everything Abraham did and followed him around the ranch with the devoted attention of a small person who has identified his primary source of information about the world and intends to extract everything from it. Abraham showed him things with the same thorough patience he brought to all of his work, explaining the fence repair and the horse care, and the planting with a seriousness that told the child, without words, that the question was worth asking and the answer was worth giving. Margaret, at 6 months, was already demonstrating the focused personality the Mrs. Chen had predicted, examining everything within reach with an analytical intensity that made Emma think she might be drawn to the same kind of work that Emma herself loved. But that was future, for now she was small and present and fiercely herself, and the house held her with the easy fullness of a place that had always had room for her. Beaumont, who was not a young man, had been struggling with his health through the spring, and Emma had taken over more of his accounts as a matter of practicality, which had turned into a more formal arrangement by the summer. He was not dying exactly, but he was slowing, and the store required more support, and the community required the store, and so these things arranged themselves around the needs at hand. His sister-in-law, who had moved into the house with him in April, was a capable woman of 60 with a brisk, effective manner, and between herself and Emma, the store remained what it needed to be. Beaumont said to Emma one afternoon, sitting in the chair behind his counter that he had occupied for 30 years with the philosophical ease of a man who has arrived at a settled view of his own life, "This town was not going to make it without you." Emma considered this. "It was going to make it," she said. "It just needed a school." "It needed more than a school," he said. "It needed someone to come here and decide to stay. That's a different thing." She thought about that. She thought about the train pulling out of the station, and the carpetbag on the platform, and the particular quality of the afternoon air that first day, and the walk down the main street to Beaumont's door. "I decided to stay the second day," she said. He nodded, unsurprised. "The wall," he said. "The wall," she agreed. In the fall of 1878, Emma had a letter from Caleb's father. He had moved with Caleb to the county seat, where he had taken a position with a freight company, and the letter was stilted and imperfect but entirely genuine, the letter of a man who had not written many letters and was writing this one because it needed to be written. He said that Caleb still talked about school and about Miss Harper, that he had started school again in the new town and was doing well, and that his father understood, in retrospect, what had been given to his son during those years and was grateful. Emma sat with the letter for a while and then put it in the wooden box with her mother's letter and the things that mattered. She taught school through the fall and into the winter, and the winter into the spring of 1879, and her students came and went as families moved and arrived. But the school itself was now as much a part of Dustfield as the church and the general store. an institution that had been built from a damaged wall and a carpetbag, and the conviction that the work was worth doing. On the last Saturday of April in 1879, they went back to the hill. Emma and Abraham and Thomas, who was now old enough to walk the whole way without needing to be carried, and Margaret in the carrier on Abraham's back. The spring had come in earnest, and the grass was new and green, and the sky was the first deep blue of the season, and the wind at the crest of the hill had the particular warmth of a wind that has come a long way over warming land and arrived pleased with itself. They stood at the top and looked out at the 30 miles. Thomas, who was 3.5 and had the earnest, literal quality of a child who takes the world seriously, said, "It is very big." "Yes," Abraham said. "Can we see our house?" "No, we're too far away." "But it's there." "It's there," Abraham confirmed. "East of us. We came from it to get here." Thomas considered this with his characteristic thoroughness. "Okay," he said, satisfied. Margaret, from her position on Abraham's back, made a sound that was her contribution to the conversation, and Thomas turned to look at her with the mix of protectiveness and mild exasperation that was his standard relationship with his sister. Emma stood with the spring wind in her hair, loose now in the way she had begun to wear it on Saturdays when there was no formal reason to keep it up, and looked at the land and the sky and then at her family, this specific, irreplaceable collection of people that she had arrived at through choices made on instinct and kept by conviction. Abraham was watching her. She knew his watching without looking. She had known it since the schoolhouse, since the rain, since the hill the first time. She turned and found his eyes. There was nothing that needed to be said. They had said it all by now, in every language they knew, the spoken and the unspoken, the daily and the extraordinary. What was in his face was the same thing that was in hers, she thought. Not happiness exactly, though it was happy. Not contentment, though it was content. It was more like the specific feeling of being in the right place with the right people doing the right things, which was, she had come to believe, as close as a person got to the thing they were looking for. "Ready to go home?" he asked. She looked at the view once more, the 30 miles of the world, the sky and the grass and the wide, impersonal beauty of it. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They came down the hill into the afternoon light with the children between them and the horses patient at the bottom, and the ranch visible in the distance as they descended. The squared timber house and the stable and the garden and the woodpile stacked with its careful precision. The whole of it meaning what it had always meant to Abraham and meaning now, to Emma, the same thing and more. They rode back through the gold afternoon, through grass that moved in the wind like breath, under a sky that went on forever in the way the sky out here always went on, and Thomas rode in front of Abraham and made observations about the landscape with the confidence of a child who trusts that his observations will be received. And Margaret reached from the carrier to catch the passing grass with her small, certain hand. Emma rode beside them and felt the full weight of the life she had built, felt it without flinching, without needing it to be anything other than exactly what it was. The hard parts were real. The distances and the weather and the uncertainties and the injustices of the larger world that she could not solve from a ranch in Dustfield, Texas, in the year 1879, were all real. None of them canceled the rest of it. None of them canceled the hill or the coffee in the rain, or the wall that Abraham had repaired with his careful hands, or the waltz at the church social, or the morning he had told her he loved her with the sunset going red behind the pasture, or the children, or the school, or the years of days that had accumulated into the specific, irreplaceable substance of her life. She had come to Dustfield on a train in the spring of 1874 with a carpetbag and a set of choices she had made on instinct, and the instinct had been right. It had been right because she had been paying attention to the place and the people and the particular quiet man who had opened his door with a coffee cup in his hand and listened to her without interrupting, and then, in the fullness of time, had told her plainly that he loved her because he did not see a reason to keep it in. She did not see a reason to keep anything in any more. The full and complicated and imperfect and wholly sufficient life they had made together was as open and clear as the land it was built on, and she was glad of every piece of it. The ranch came into view around the last turn, the house with the afternoon light on its south wall, the window of the room where Thomas had been born catching the sun, and throwing it back in a bright specific point of light that she had noticed before and always liked, like the house offering a signal. Abraham said, without turning, as though he had known she was looking at it, "I've been thinking about adding a porch on the south side." "For the morning light," she said. "And the view," he said. She considered the view. The flat, wide, gold and green country of the Texas plains, the sky above it performing its endless variations, the line of the horizon that was always the same distance and always new. "Yes," she said, "for the view." They came home.